Welcome to Epg Php. We are doing philosophy, and this is in the paper Metaphysics. The topic of this module is Metaphysics of Modernity. I am Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. One way to begin with this topic is to place on the table the centrality of self in the making of this huge worldview called modernity. Self is at the center of modernity. Human self is the fulcrum of modernity. Without human-centeredness, without self, modernity is not conceivable. Having said this, what is important to locate is that there is a close relation between self and the other. Is it possible to talk about self without the other? Is other possible without self, or larger metaphysical questions that preoccupied many people? Now, let me take this abstract and a very important relation, or the fundamental relation between self and the other, into its specific form. In 20th century, you have a very important school of thought that came to problematize the relation between self and other in a concrete form. West as the self and the non-West as the other. And then they alleged that it is the West that created, according to its own representational logic and dictates of politics, its other, namely the non-West. And then at stage 2, you have others claiming that the self is a victor and the other is a victim. And you understand now what I am heading at. I am getting right into the heart of colonialism or imperialism, where this phrase gets circulated, that it is a West which is a victor, victimizing the non-West within the political space of colonialism. Now, the question that I would like to ask here is, while accepting that there is the self, West as a self, which is a victor, and there is the other, non-West as the other, which is a victimized, the question that I wanted to raise at this point is, did the self or the modern self victimize the other, the outside the West, in the beginning itself, or did the self also victimized earlier to its victimizing the other, its own other? In other words, what is the project of modernity? The project of modernity, in the writings of those like Edward Said, looks as if there is a West that is oppressing the non-West. Now, I wanted to complicate this terrain by asking, isn't there a, or wasn't there an internal other to modernity within the West? In other words, the first attack of modernity was on Christianity and Greek thought. So Christian metaphysics, Christian theology, and Greek metaphysics or the first other of modern self, and that is an important point to reckon with in looking at the nature of this self. So this is my first point in laying bare the metaphysics of modernity. Modernity is in relation to the non-modern, but we should also look at how modernity had its own pre-modern as its first other. Now, this brings us to a point 2 of our discussion. The point 2 of our discussion is that in the discussions on post-colonialism, you have theories that suggested how the outside to the non-West has always oppressed the non-West. In other words, the West oppressed the East. Okay, I wanted to argue that is the other to the non-West, that is the West, always to be taken as an oppressor? Isn't it possible to see that an outsider can also enable us? Because the crucial point that drives me to explore this possibility is, if you consider the outsider as an oppressor, then you have a problem. You have a larger problem. The larger problem is, if outsider is an oppressor, then learning requires an outsider. Learning does not mean I learn from myself. I learn from the outsider. Now, extending this domain, if outsider is the monopolizer of the oppression, of my oppression, then I cannot learn from the outsider. It is in this context, I think, there is a need to relook at this thing in taking two important instances from the 20th century. Take the instance of Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda was told by Reverend Hasty about Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. So Reverend Hasty, an outsider, enabling Vivekananda to meet his guru, lifelong guru, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. So now you look at here, an outsider is not an oppressor, an outsider is an enabler, enabling Vivekananda to meet his real guru and a future guru. And what happened after this meeting, and how Vivekananda went on to become an international figure. But please remember, at the seed of this phenomena called Vivekananda is Reverend Hasty, who works like a seed. Now, interestingly, there is another instance in the case of another important 20th century thinker from India, namely Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was asked by two theosophical people to read Gita. They asked him whether he read Gita and asked him to tell them about Gita. Gandhi has to confess that he did not read Gita. And they gave him a copy of a translation of Gita. So please remember here that it is the outsider who asked Gandhi to read Gita, and he reads it in England, which is outside place, and then he reads it in translation, that is Arnold's Light of Asia. Now look at all the three aspects of this outside, and then we all know what is the impact Gita had on Gandhi. So it is in this context I wanted to try this idea that outsider can be oppressor, it also can be an enabler. So let me now make my third point in this context. It is generally asked, is it possible to have a non-Western reading of the West? So that brings us to the topic of our module. is it possible to have a non-Western reading of modernity? Let me try something like this in this module. The question regarding the non-Western reading of the West, particularly non-Western reading of modernity, is raised in the context of present India. There is something very interesting about the present context of India because of the following things: that unlike West, which disinherited its pre-modern past, India is to live both with its pre-modern past and also has to borrow from the Western modernity. So India has a simultaneous relation between pre-modern and modern, whereas West has a sequential relation between pre-modern and modern. Alternatively, pre-modern has to exit for modern to take place in the West. In other words, the exit of the pre-modern is the precondition for the entry of the modernity in the West. In contrast, in India, you have both pre-modern and modern simultaneously. And now this is something which is different, but the difference also can be very, very complex. So it is in this context I want to excavate the history of modern self in the following and identify its nature. India can, from this point of view, can take a critical look at the new institutions like old age home through this philosophical journey. Now, one way to understand the metaphysics of modernity is to begin with the ideas that are there in its pre-modern within the West. Let me begin with Aristotle. Aristotle is known for saying the whole is prior to parts. So for him, whole is prior to parts and parts are dependent on whole. But there is something else that he said which is of paramount interest, and unfortunately this has not been recognized by many people. Now Aristotle in his Polis talks about something very interesting. He says that for analytical purpose, a whole, which is a polis, can be divided into villages. Villages can be divided into communities. Communities can be divided into family. Families can be divided into male and female. And he says that male and female, which is a pair, cannot be further divided. The reason why male and female cannot be further divided, according to Aristotle, is for an individual to come into existence, two people should have come in sexual union. So two is a primary unit, pair is a primary unit. How did those two people come into existence? Another two people came into sexual union. So for the progeny to develop, you need two people. So in other words, what is important to remember is, in Aristotle arithmetic, it is not that you begin with 1, 2, 3 or you begin with 0, 1, 2, 3. Actually, you begin with 2, then 0, 1, 3, 4, like that. So there is a very interesting notion of numbering that takes place in Aristotle, which is the basic unit for Aristotle is 2 and not 1 or 0, as is the case for many people both in India and in the West. Okay, so he begins with 2. Now, what is the importance of beginning with 2? The beginning with 2 is so important because it does not allow the 1 to come into existence. It circumvents the possibility of 1. Now, if you circumvent the possibility of 1, it has serious implications particularly to modernity. Without one, you can't have individualism. Individualism can proliferate, individualism can emerge only on the platform of one. The primacy of one is important for the individual to emerge. The platform of one is the bedrock of the individualism. If that bedrock is not there, if that platform is not there, one is not there, then individual is not there. And without individual, it is not possible for modernity to come into existence. So the foundations of modernity lies with individualism, and individualism requires one, and Aristotle does not allow this one to come into existence. So you see the importance, the underlying metaphysical aspect underlying the impossibility of modernity because of Aristotle. Because of Aristotle. There is a particular way through which this problem comes to be modified with Christianity, with the creationism, which is a different matter. I will not go into it, nor am I competent to go into that. But what is important is Aristotle circumvented the possibility of one, and without one, individual is not possible. Without individual, modernity cannot take off. Okay. Now let us look at the related thing in Descartes. Now, several centuries pass through, and I don't think that there is anybody who could surpass or answer this check that Aristotle has proposed. Now, this problem in a conscious or unconscious way comes to be confronted by the father of modernity, René Descartes. Descartes, in a crucial passage in Discourse on Method, says the following. He says, I quote, I reflected that we were children before being men and had to be governed for some time by our appetites and our teachers, which were often opposed to each other, and neither of which perhaps always gave us the best advice. Hence I thought it virtually impossible that our judgment should be as unclouded and firm as they would have been if we had had the full use of our reason from the moment of our birth, and if we had always been guided by it alone. Unquote. Now, what is important about this passage is the following. One, it talks about how we are not born with reason as children, but it is desirable to have rationality from childhood, but that is not possible to have rationality from childhood. So he is saying something very interesting here. He is saying that don't bother about when a child is born. That is not the concern of philosophy. The concern of philosophy for Descartes is not about what is happening in a maternity ward, how children are born, whether two people are required for somebody to come into existence. That is not the job. The job is, when do a human being become rational? That is the primary importance. And when do you become? You become rational according to them when you become an adult. So in other words, for Descartes, it is not how and when children are born, but when do they become rational, and they become rational when they become adult. So please remember an important thing, two important things that have a civilizational implications. One, he is knocking down the very domain called childhood from modernity. So subsequent to Descartes, childhood becomes not an important aspect of modernity. So this is something like similar to that of chopping off the roots of a tree. the roots of the tree. The childhood is in my reading, is the root of the tree. Okay. Now you have a log of a wood, not a tree. Second important point that we should remember here is that in making this move, which has serious implications both at a societal and at a philosophical and at individual level, Aristotle is not answered by Descartes. Aristotle is only bypassed by Descartes. In other words, Descartes does not answer Aristotle. Descartes does not solve Aristotle's problem. What Descartes is embarking is, he is jumping over Aristotle. He is jumping over Aristotle because he does not know how to solve Aristotle, how to unlock Aristotle philosophically. So this is the something that haunts modernity. This aspect of Aristotle's problem being not solved or faced by Descartes has not been a philosophically an important issue for the scholarship around both Descartes or Aristotle. But I think for some of us from India, this is of a paramount interest, and I'll come to you why it is of a paramount interest. So let us sum up the discussion. Now you have with Descartes, Aristotle bypassed, and the idea of one, because it is bypassed, and you have an individual. But unlike many people, I want to claim this I, this self, is a self bereft of childhood. It is a bereft of childhood. In other words, now this self of Descartes is a rootless self. It's a rootless self. It is a self without roots. That's the next stage. If this is clear, let us get into the next innings of modernity. After first innings of modernity, you have a second innings, and in the second innings you have Rousseau. Rousseau does something very interesting. What he does is the following. In his book Social Contract, he has this passage where he says, the most ancient of all societies and the only one that is natural is the family. And even so, the children remain attached to the father only so long as they need him for their preservation. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond is dissolved. The children released from the obedience they owed to the father, and the father released from the care he owed his children, return equally independence. If they remain united, they continue so no longer naturally but voluntarily, and the family itself is then maintained only by convention. Now, what is interesting about this crucial passage, this foundational passage of modernity, is the first point is that he refers to only father. And many feminists have identified why is it that mother is not referred to. I will come to feminism later in this module, but not on this topic. The second point that is very problematic is, as a social contract philosopher, he is referring to something which is very, very important, and we need to decipher it carefully. He is saying that father has to take care of the child and the bond gets dissolved. Now, if it is a transaction, then the bond actually doesn't get dissolved because the transaction is not closed. It's not complete. You know why? If father spends his money and time on the child and he gets nothing in return from the child. So if he gets nothing in return from the child, the transaction is not closed. Okay, in the classical system, in the traditional system, of a circularity. You have parents taking care of children and children take care of parents when they are old, and the transaction is complete. But here the transaction is not complete. Okay, so that's the big problem. But if you look at the passage carefully, there is a way in which a transaction can be said to be completed. Okay, and that requires not seeing the relation between father and son and father in a mutually interactive way, but in a linear way. Okay, by bringing, in addition to the relation between father and son, the relation between father's father. That is, the father is not to be cleared by the child. You know why? Or the child is not indebted to the father because the father is only clearing what he owed to his father, who spent money for his childhood. In other words, at a deeper level, there is some radical structural change that is taking place, and the radical structural change is that there is a move to convert a circular idea of life to a linear idea of life. Okay, so I pay to my child and my child will pay to his child, and it goes on. This is the most important contribution of Rousseau. We are all enticed to Rousseau, not for what he says in the text, but what he has initiated in this radical, at an unconscious, structural way. So the circularity gives rise to linearity. What is wrong with it? Nothing is wrong with it. But the following has happened. And what happened? He has chopped off the old age from modernity. That children need not take care of their parents when they become old. This is the first foundation for a new institution called old age. Now, the consequences of this idea to our lesson is, now to a self whose roots are already chopped off, with this passage the top gets chopped off. Now it becomes a log of wood. The self now is without branches. It's similar to that of a log of wood, which is ready to be burnt by the capitalistic system, where you become merely a worker. You are not allowed to waste your time on the next generation. If at all you are allowed to take care of your children, that is only because childhood is not desirable in itself, but childhood is necessary for adult to come out of it. So this is the point that I am trying to make. So with this, what happens is, the self is not only rootless, the self is also topless. It is now ready as a log of wood, ready to be sized in the capitalistic mode of production. It has no branches. Let me just make one or 2 points, not at an emotional level, not at a charitable level, about old age. Okay, now you might ask, why should we spend time with people who are old, which is a very unproductive thing? Now I want to make these following points for your consideration. One, all of us will become old unless we meet some accident and then have to die early. All of us will become old, and if you have a family system where there are old people, you will come to know what is it to live the life of a old age. I'm not making a point that old people need you. I'm saying you need old people. Why? for the third point, that it is desirable to know what you need to do as a old person, not when you become old, but when you are already young. In other words, preparing for old age is easier when you know about it when you are adult. It will be still easier if you know it from your childhood. In other words, old age is not something that will come to you all of a sudden. It is possible to calibrate your actions to distinguish what is important at a human level and how much of myself is to be allowed to be used for productive processes. That awareness can come desirably from the childhood, necessarily from the adulthood. It will be a desperate if one gets to know what is it to live a old age life when you become old, because at old age you may not have energies to calibrate to a different kinds of lifestyle, but you might have flexibility and energy to calibrate to lead life of old age when you are young. So this is one of the points that I wanted to bring it to your notice. This is particularly important because India, as I said in the middle of the module, is in a crossroads. Now we are going to face the problem of old age homes. Now what is our take? Instead of just facing it when it comes to us, we should be able to address this problem before it becomes an indomitable reality. So now you have the Cartesian self without roots, without branches, without the top. Now let me bring into discussion an important discussion within Western political philosophy. There is an essay by Susan Muller-Okin, who in her essay Reason and Feeling in Thinking About Justice says something very, very interesting. And this is interesting because this is a fundamental critique of modernity. And what does he say? She says that in the traditional times, morality was based on God, and modernity came and rejected this and offered an alternative where morality is based on reason. Now if morality is based on reason, there is nothing wrong, but she says that morality is based on reason and reason excludes emotions. So you have a morality that is not only based on reason, but the reason on which it is based excludes emotion. And she quotes Kant and says the following, and she says that Kant in all his minor works, but consistently from beginning to end, maintained that man is associated with reason and woman is associated with emotion. And I quote her. She says, Kant is abundantly clear that feelings ought to have no place in the foundation of morality. Kant says, I quote, no moral principle is based, as people sometimes suppose, on any feeling whatsoever, for feeling, no matter by what it is aroused, always belongs to the order of nature. So feelings belong to the order of nature, and nature is contrasted with freedom. So in the doctrine of virtue, Kant classifies love into two types. One he calls practical love or benevolence, which he says sometimes results from the performance of duty to help yourself. He says the other type of feeling Kant recognizes is the pathological feeling or attraction. So there are two kinds of loves. One is the practical love, the other one is the pathological feeling. So Okin says that while in most of his central works of moral philosophy, Kant defines the moral subjects of whom he speaks as not only human beings, but also all rational beings as such. In less noticed works, but from the earliest to the last, he makes it clear that women are not sufficiently rational and autonomous to be moral subjects. In an earlier essay entitled observations of the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, he says of women that their philosophy is not to reason but to sense. Their virtue, he goes on to say, unlike men, is to be inspired by the desire to please. Kant says that for women there is to be nothing of duty, nothing of compulsion, nothing of obligation. In one of his last works, The Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, although most uncharacteristically he says that male and female are both rational beings, he takes back any thought of moral autonomy in the case of a married woman by pointing out that she is necessarily subject to her husband and legal minor. To quote, to make oneself behave like a minor, he says, degrading as it may be, is nonetheless very comfortable, unquote. And she asked the question, is it not difficult to tell from such remarks where woman stands? Perhaps is more appropriate to say where woman sits on Kant's moral scale. So what is important in this is that the modernity, modern self, is bereft of the roots because they knocked down childhood. It excluded the old age, so the top is gone, and now another dimension is added to this process where modernity is also bereft of emotions and women are equated with emotions. So now you have an adult male which is a cognitive nude. Now the point that we need to do is that if this is the achievement of modernity, of accomplishing a cognitive nude who does not have roots on the top and the emotive aspects of human existence, then how is this self, the modern self, different from a machine? If the difference is marginal, is this the achievement of modernity? Is this the accomplishment of the major deeds of the modern civilization, which Gandhi called, which is an interesting idea. Now the point of laying bare or tracing the genealogy of the metaphysics of modernity is to ask this question in the context of the contemporary India, that in the context of modern India, that non-modern societies like India have to attend to the past and indomitable evils in their own society like untouchability and patriarchy. But they also have to critically assess the desirability or otherwise of the predicament of modernity by looking at this metaphysics of modernity from the outside. This module need not be taken as an indictment of modernity. It should be taken as a philosophical engagement with modernity. Now, it is not recommendatory, it is only an exploratory thing, trying to bring onto the table certain things that have not been covered in the mainstream discussion. Now, if I request the students to read Aristotle, Descartes, Rousseau, Susan Muller, Okin, and the most important inspiration for getting an idea like this is reading both Gandhi and Foucault. Thank you.